Those verses right there show that God is absolutely in control. He's absolutely in control of everything. Now here's the thing. A lot of people don't have any problem in saying, yeah, that's true. That's true. God is in control of everything. But yet when it comes down to some of the decisions that they make, such as, well, particularly in the area of salvation, then all of a sudden they have a problem. So, here's the deal. Do you believe that God is absolutely sovereign over everything, every aspect of the universe, including right down to the aspect of salvation? Now, you need to be careful how you answer that, because if you say yes, then you're going to start getting into a lot of areas that you probably don't want to get into. And I'm telling you, the subject of God's sovereignty in the area of salvation is a very emotional subject for some people. And I remember many, many years ago, Danny and I actually were debating about this, and he had really just come to embrace Reformed theology. I was still pretty much dead set against it. And it became emotional at times. It became emotional. And it wasn't until May of 2007, I believe it was, that I really began to look at Reformed theology in a serious light. I stopped doing what a lot of people do, reading into the Scriptures what I've been taught. I remember taking a Muslim evangelism class. My wife and I were in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, taking a Muslim evangelism class during that spring. And we had a couple hours before our next class, and so I was just up in the room, and I'd gone to the book of Romans, and I started in the classic passage, Romans chapter 9. And I told myself before I started, you know what, I'm just going to read very carefully, very slowly, and I'm going to let my eyes rest on every single word. And I think it took me more than 30 minutes or more maybe to read through that chapter, because I wanted to read it as much as I could without any of my presuppositions that I'd always been taught. And so during that time, when I finished reading it, I remember just closing my Bible, and I remember thinking, you know what? God is sovereign, and if that's what He chooses to do, then that's what He chooses to do. And it was probably at that point that I really began to lean more towards Reformed theology, and it was really more solidified after my brother gave me a copy of The Potter's Freedom by Dr. James White. I mentioned him earlier. When I read that book, it kind of solidified my belief in Reformed theology. So it can be an emotional subject. And the problem is a lot of people strip these verses out of context when they're dealing with God's sovereignty in the area of salvation. And I'll give you an example. Matthew 11:28. Most of us know that. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Now, how many of us know that? But the question is, how many of us know the verse before that? Matthew 11:27. Let me read it to you. This is Jesus speaking. All things have been handed over to me by the Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him. Now, did you catch that? Anyone to whomever the Son wills or wishes or desires to reveal him. That's very, very clear. The word there that's wishes or desires. Some translations may have desire. Some translations may have wish. I'm using the ESV, so it uses the word will, but the word is boulomai, and it means a choice or an action of the will with intention and purpose. Okay. Now, the more amazing thing is if you go back a couple of verses to verse 25. Well, actually, at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus really begins to denounce all of the cities that He had done His miracles in. You know, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida. If the miracles that had been done and you had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. And He goes through His 7 woes there in the first part of the verse. And then when you get down to verse 25, Matthew tells us this. He says, at that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent, and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for this was well-pleasing in your sight. So what exactly is Jesus saying there? Is Jesus saying that he actually hides his identity? He hides his will from certain people? Yeah, I think he is. Because right after that, in verse 27, he makes the statement that nobody knows the Son except whoever the Son wishes to reveal him. And then in 28, he gives the invitation, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And so the invitation is for those whom the Father has revealed the Son to. And if you look at that verse within context, you see that. But most people just jump straight to the invitation part, and they never really look at the context. And even when you're in a church service, a lot of times the pastor will skip right over the context. And I'm not saying that's done purposely. I'm just saying that oftentimes we think of these verses right off the top of our head, but we don't consider the context. So that's important. It is important when we're talking about the sovereignty of God. Another thing is about the sovereignty of God is we see in Scripture that he's absolute ruler over all of his creation. He has authority over his creation, but he rules over his creation. Psalms 24, 1 and 2 says, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers." Psalm 96:10, "Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity." And so there you have a declaration of the earth being God's. Now, if the earth is God's, and the world and those who dwell in it are God's, then that means God has the absolute freedom to do whatever he wants with his creation. He has absolute authority. Everything that happens, he brings it to pass. He ordains everything that comes to pass. And I know a lot of people don't like the idea that God has ordained suffering, that God has ordained bad things to happen, but it does. He has. And I'm going to catch a lot of flack for this, but you know what? I'm going to say it anyway. The incident that took place in 9/11 was ordained by God. This presidential election that took place with Obama winning for a second term was ordained by God. The economic crunch that America is feeling right now was ordained by God. That person who may drive out on the highway today and be killed in a head-on collision was ordained by God. And yeah, it is a hard thing to come to grasp with. It's a hard reality to swallow. But the fact is that God doesn't just take his hand off the earth and say, well, here you go, do whatever you want. God is actively involved in every aspect of his creation. Isaiah 46, 9 and 10 says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient time things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Isaiah there prophesying to the people of Israel there, telling them what's going to happen, telling them that God is the one that is in control, not their false prophets, not those prophesying peace, like in Jeremiah's time, and saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. God makes it absolutely clear that from the very end to the beginning, that he has already ordained everything that's come to pass. I love exactly what R.C. Sproul says. Sproul says this: when we speak of divine sovereignty, we are speaking of God's authority and about God's power. As sovereign, God is the supreme authority of heaven and earth. All other authority is lesser authority. Any other authority that exists in the universe is derived from and dependent upon God's authority. All other forms of authority exist either by God's command or by God's permission. And that's from the book Chosen by God, page 24. Very good book. If you ever get a chance to read it, it goes through the doctrine of election, basically, and predestination. And it covers double predestination and all that good stuff. So if you ever get a chance, read the book. And we're going to be talking about some of those things on here. We're not going to get to them today, obviously. You could spend podcast after podcast after podcast talking about the sovereignty of God and all the areas that it covers. And we're just mainly trying to hit on the main points here. So that's all we're trying to do. Another good verse. In Lamentations 3:37 and 38, who has spoken and it came to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? And you have to remember here in Lamentations that the context is the destruction of the southern tribe, of Judah, Jerusalem. This is right after Jerusalem is destroyed. And remember, Jeremiah, who wrote the book of Jeremiah, is also writing Lamentations here, just weeping over it, weeping over the fact that God has forsaken his own people. And in there in chapter 3 and verse 37 and 38, he makes this declaration. And he says, good and bad come from God. There's no way around it. We can't deny, we can't continue to say, well, good comes from God and bad comes from Satan. Because it doesn't. Bad does come from God. 1 Chronicles 29:12, both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And then again, Psalm 33:9-11, for he spoke, and it came to be, he commanded, and it stood firm. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generation. And so there's just a few verses for you to show exactly how sovereign God is. When we talk about the sovereignty of God, we are mainly talking about the freedom of God to do whatever he desires. And that includes in every single area of our lives, whether that be good, whether it be bad, whether it be salvation, whether it be reprobation, whether it be rich, whether it be poor, whether it be anything. If anything influences God's sovereignty, let me rephrase that. If any outside influence comes in and dictates how God rules or what God does, then by very definition, God cannot be sovereign. Because the definition of sovereignty is that God, or authority without control. Webster's Dictionary, supreme lord or ruler, one who possesses the highest authority without control. And I think that is the key there. That's the key of that definition. Anything that comes in from the outside that dictates how God rules, then by very definition, God would not be sovereign. Those are just a few things to keep in mind, and unfortunately I had to cut it really short today because I have to leave for work here in about 10 minutes, and I wish I could have gone over the whole thing with you. I don't know, maybe Danny and I will on Sunday kind of rehash this subject before we move on to the next one. And I'm sorry it was so short today, but I'm off, and I have to go to work, and I will not be home till later on this evening. So folks, please have a good one. Continue to listen. God bless you. We appreciate you listening and downloading our podcast.